You were taught to feel safe when someone smiled, to move closer when their voice grew gentle, to believe that warmth meant kindness. So when they spoke softly, you listened. When they looked genuine, you trusted. When they acted pleasant, you let your guard down. But you've been deceived more times than you can count, not by obvious threats, not by loud hostility, but by gentleness, by faces that felt harmless, by words coated in sweetness, yet filled with intent. That's the kind of wound that's hard to explain. It didn't cut it, didn't leave a mark, it just stayed. You assumed honesty based on how they sounded. You took behavior as truth. But Machiavelli understood better. He wrote that people deceive willingly and that image outweighs intent. He didn't say this out of bitterness. He said it to gain clarity. Because the world isn't controlled by those who are virtuous, it's controlled by those who seem virtuous while operating on a deeper level. You weren't betrayed by villains. You were betrayed by facades, by those who knew how to play the exact part you needed them to. They watched your kindness, mimicked your openness, gave just enough to feel real. And you gave them your trust, not because they proved worthy, but because you believed the illusion. This is the lie that robs you of power, the belief that kindness proves integrity, that tone equals truth, that a warm smile can't deceive. But it can, and it often does. You weren't naive. You were taught, trained to equate charm with safety, taught that suspicion was a weakness, that doubt made you damaged. But what if softness wasn't your default setting? What if your edge was protection, not a problem? They told you to lower your defenses the moment love appeared. But maybe that's when you should hold them tighter. Because this is where most people lose before they realize they're even in a game. They mistake appearance for depth. They let their longing for closeness override their sense of discernment. And in that fleeting moment of misplaced faith, they give away their strength. Machiavelli advised, never outshine the master. Never reveal your full hand. Never trust what you see. Not because humanity is wicked, but because people are naturally tactical. And you're still navigating with emotional principles in a calculated world. You don't have to grow cold, but you must become conscious. Because the ones who can wound you deepest are rarely obvious threats. They're the ones who smile while observing you, praise you, while profiling you, draw close not to cherish but to study, but to understand how to influence you. Want to outmaneuver the world? Then start here. Not every smile holds innocence. Not every gentle tone is rooted in truth. And not every hand extended toward you comes with kind intent. Some come to map out your weaknesses. And if you're still equating charm with character, then you're not prepared to thrive. You're primed to be manipulated. They can't dismantle what they can't detect. That's rule number one. Not because you aim to mislead, but because once they glimpse your path, they'll start shaping ways to divert it. People don't always sabotage out of hostility. Sometimes it's out of insecurity, envy, or simply the urge to dominate something, even if that something is you. If they anticipate your next step, they'll counter it. If they grasp what drives you, they'll find ways to turn it against you. So your top priority must be this: stay unreadable. Machiavelli grasped this well before psychology gave it a name. He didn't speak in emotional terms. He spoke in terms of strategy and outcomes. Keep your goals concealed, not from spite, but from wisdom. Because openness is a form of currency you can't afford to spend freely. The more they uncover, the more they'll try to steer. The more they speculate, the more they'll interfere. So let them guess, but never verify. You've been trained to overshare, to justify yourself, to reveal your inner workings, all under the illusion of integrity, clarity, and goodwill. But how often has your vulnerability been weaponized? How many times has your honesty become ammunition in someone else's agenda? There's no virtue in being entirely exposed. There's no prize for being emotionally available to all. You may believe you're earning trust, but you're really handing them a guidebook, one they'll reference when it suits them to strike. You must become less traceable. Speak less. Use misdirection. Let your quietness leave them uncertain. If they can't discern your wants, they won't discover your fears. And if your fears remain hidden, they stay powerless. What if you stopped announcing your plans before they were real? What if you stopped offering people the full layout of your mind just to feel seen? They don't need to know what you're crafting. They don't need insight into your emotions. Let them encounter your distance long before they ever decipher your essence. That's how real power takes root, not through exposure, but through control. They'll say you've changed, that you're colder distant, more calculated. Let them speak. Those are just echoes of people losing access. People who once fed off your openness, people who depended on your predictability to keep their own comfort. When they no longer understand your desires, they start to fear your potential moves. That uncertainty, that tension becomes your protection. Machiavelli once said, even the most righteous must learn to walk through shadows. Not because darkness is virtuous, but because exposure too often makes you a target. Want to outthink anyone? Then stop giving them the blueprint. Let them witness your smile, but not your motives. Let them hear your voice, but never grasp your intent. Because once you become unpredictable, you break free from their grip. You believed your presence proved your value, that showing up was a sign of devotion, of loyalty, of strength. So you kept appearing over and over, even when they didn't care, even when they didn't earn it. You stayed not out of reward, but because you thought consistency equaled integrity. You were taught that availability was synonymous with love. But what if it isn't? What if your constant presence is what made you invisible? Machiavelli saw what most ignore: when power is expected, it loses its edge. Influence fades when it's always within reach. And the more familiar you become, the easier you are to overlook. This is why one of the most powerful moves is to withdraw. Not out of weakness, but from wisdom. Absence teaches what presence cannot. It brings clarity. It signals worth. It creates consequence. When you stop offering your attention freely, people begin to question its value. When you no longer arrive uninvited, they wonder why they assumed you always would. Your absence isn't emptiness. It's potential condensed. It's silence that commands. You worry they'll forget you if you step back, but what if disappearing is the only way they learn to remember? The mind doesn't chase what it possesses. It longs for what it fears losing. When you're always around, you become part of the background, static, unnoticed, expected. But when you go quiet, when you become rare, you become a question. They can't solve a void. They can't ignore a presence that haunts. You were never meant to be endlessly accessible. Your availability is not a badge of honor, it's a resource. And resources, when used wisely, carry power. Not when given constantly, but when applied strategically. What if you stopped being the first to reach out? What if you gave only what was earned? What if you chose your moments instead of letting others choose for you? This isn't about manipulation, it's about self-respect. You've feared that stepping back would erase you. But Machiavelli would say the opposite is true. People remember those who shift the balance, those who disturb routine, those who disappear the moment they're taken for granted. Let them sit with the silence you leave. Let them wonder why it suddenly feels heavier without you. You were taught to feel at ease when someone smiled, to draw closer when their tone softened, to assume that warmth meant integrity. So when their voice became calm, you listened. When their expression looked sincere, you trusted. When they appeared kind, you let your guard down. But you've been deceived more times than you care to admit. Not by direct hostility or loud malice, but by softness, by faces that seemed harmless. By words sweetened on the surface, but carrying hidden agendas. That's a wound you struggled to define. It didn't bruise, it didn't bleed. It didn't bleed, but it never left. You mistook tone for honesty, gestures for truth. But Machiavelli saw through that illusion. He wrote that people are easily misled and that image outweighs intention. Not to sow distrust, but to create awareness. Because the world isn't governed by those who are good. It's controlled by those who appear good while pursuing a more complex agenda. You weren't betrayed by villains. You were betrayed by disguises. By those who knew how to become exactly what you wanted. They observed your kindness, mirrored your vulnerability, and gave just enough to gain your faith. And you gave them everything, not because they earned it, but because their act was convincing. This is the lie that disempowers you, the belief that kindness equals character, that soft voices can't deceive. But they can, and they do constantly. You weren't naive. You were conditioned, trained to associate charm with security, taught that caution made you bitter, that doubt was a weakness. But what if being sharp wasn't your flaw? What if it was your armor? They told you to put down your defenses as soon as affection appeared. But maybe that's when your guard should go up, because this is where most people fail before the game has even started. They mistake the surface for the soul. They let their desire for closeness override their instinct for protection. And in a moment of misplaced belief, they give away their power. Machiavelli advised, never outshine those above you. Never expose your full plan. Never trust appearances. Not because humanity is cruel, but because people are tactical. And you're still responding emotionally in a world run by calculation. You don't have to become numb, but you do have to become aware. Because the ones who hurt you most aren't always loud. They're the ones who smile while gathering information, who compliment while studying, who get close not to care but to figure out how to steer you. Want to outmaneuver the world? Then understand this: not every smile is clean, not every quiet tone is sincere, and not every extended hand comes with care. Some approach you to learn your framework. And if you're still mistaking charm for integrity, you're not prepared to succeed, you're primed to be taken advantage of. You no longer react when they mislabel you. You just look through them, steady, unreadable, beyond reach. That's the core of dominance controlling the frame. When they mock you and you remain unmoved, the illusion cracks. When they bait you and you don't respond, the narrative collapses. When they attempt to shrink you and you stay expansive in silence, they start to question everything they assume. You don't need to raise your voice. You need to own your space. Let them call you cold. Weaponize. Let them say you're distant, calculated, detached. Those are flares they launch to distract from the truth that they've lost their grip on your narrative. Let them light up the sky with their noise. You stay centered, because once you hold the frame, the outside world stops dictating your identity. You start shaping the world instead. You've believed that patience equals power, that staying calm in the face of insult shows growth, that giving space to others demonstrates wisdom. But what it often shows is that your boundaries are bendable, your standards negotiable, your silence a subtle invitation. And they test it repeatedly to see just how much you'll take before you react. And when you don't, they take more. Machiavelli recognized this truth long before modern psychology gave it a label. Disrespect once tolerated compounds. It doesn't fade, it intensifies. Because when there's no immediate repercussion, people interpret it as consent. Every time you let it pass, you're teaching them it's allowed, that they can climb higher up your spine with no resistance. You were taught to hesitate, to measure your reactions, to wait for a better moment. But true power doesn't hesitate. It moves with precision. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't explain. It enforces calmly, clearly, without negotiation. You assumed reacting strongly made you weak. But real strength is cool detachment, a firm line drawn without a word, a consequence delivered without warning. It doesn't plead for understanding. It doesn't wait for remorse. It ends the exchange completely. You don't need to argue. You need to disappear. You need to stop justifying your pain. You need to stop reopening doors that deserve to stay shut. Disrespect isn't just behavior, it's a probe, a quiet question. How much of your self-respect will you give up to make me comfortable? Your answer, spoken or not, sets the standard. They'll call it a joke. They'll say you're being too sensitive. But your instincts didn't misfire. Your body responded for a reason. And every time you dismiss that feeling, they become more fluent in how to manipulate you through your tolerance. Machiavelli put it bluntly, never do an enemy a minor harm, because if they recover, they'll strike back. If you must make a move, make it final, make it count, so their response will never be a concern. You don't flinch anymore when they misdefine you. You simply meet their gaze, quiet, unaffected, unreachable. That's the essence of true power controlling the frame. When they try to belittle you and you remain still, their narrative falls apart. When they seek to provoke and you don't respond, the illusion crumbles. When they attempt to diminish you and you rise in silence, they begin to doubt their assumptions. You don't need volume, you need sovereignty. Let them label you cold, aloof, calculated. Those are just distractions, flares thrown to obscure the fact that they no longer direct your story. Let them spark the air with accusations. You stay rooted, because when you set the frame, the world no longer defines you, you define it. You've believed that waiting before you react shows control, that staying composed when insulted proves growth, that leaving space for correction shows wisdom. But what it often teaches is that your limits are flexible, your self-respect negotiable, your quietness a sign of consent. And they test that theory again and again just to see how far they can push before you break. And when you don't, they push even harder. Machiavelli grasped this truth long before psychology gave it language. When disrespect is tolerated, it expands. It doesn't vanish, it amplifies. Because without swift correction, people read passivity as permission. They assume your restraint equals agreement. And every time you ignore it, you teach them that you'll bear more weight. You were trained to hesitate to think before speaking to time your response. But power doesn't delay. Power acts with precision. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't justify. It delivers cleanly, calmly, without theatrics. You thought strong reactions meant weakness, but true dominance is icy indifference, a boundary upheld with quiet certainty, not noise. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't plead for regret. It just concludes the matter. You don't need to yell. You need to disappear. You need to stop explaining your pain. You need to stop opening the door to those who crossed a line. Because disrespect is never random. It's a test, an unspoken inquiry. How much of your dignity will you trade to make me feel comfortable? And whether you respond aloud or not, your answer sets the precedent. They'll say it was humor. They'll insist you misread it. But your gut didn't misfire. Your instincts don't overreact without cause. And every time you rationalize it away, they become more skilled at navigating your silence. Machiavelli said it best. Never do your opponent a small harm, because if they survive it, they'll strike back harder. If action must be taken, make it decisive, make it final. And in your world, the enemy doesn't always arrive with open hostility. Sometimes it's the familiar friend who slowly turns your quiet into their playground. So what happens if you don't wait this time? What happens if the moment they cross that line, you stop, not out of pain, but out of clarity, not passive, but composed? What if your boundary wasn't something to explain, but something they simply collided with firm and final? Let them feel it. Let them experience the absence of your access. Let them taste the cold edge of your detachment, not through anger, but through distance. Not through argument, but through stillness. Because when you hold a boundary without emotion, it disorients them. They expect dramateer's explanations. What they don't anticipate is silence that doesn't seek closure, a door that closes and doesn't wait to be knocked on again. And that's exactly the point. You don't earn respect through persuasion. You claim it by walking away from the places where you're forced to explain your worth. They say they love you. They say they care. But they've memorized how to reach you. They've learned your timing, your tone, the openings in your empathy. They don't have to overpower you. They only need access. And they've studied the pattern, how tears unlock your compassion, how retreat invites your return, how guilt shortens your distance. They don't have to shackle you. You hold the leash tightened by your own empathy. You've blurred the line between emotional connection and emotional exposure. You've mistaken vulnerability for trust. But Machiavelli would warn you, never reveal the full architecture of your mind, not even to those closest. Not because closeness is wrong, but because predictability surrenders power. Once they map your rhythm, they don't need pressure. They only need routine. You made it simple. You explained every pause, revealed every motive, justified every feeling. You became transparent under the guise of trust. And in doing so, you exposed yourself not for love, but for manipulation. Because once they know your cues, they begin directing the show. And you think it's cooperation. But it's choreography control disguised as closeness. Every time you reacted the same, they kept score. Every time you forgave too fast, they marked the time between harm and healing. You weren't building connection, you were becoming a cycle. A loop they learned to trigger. And now they don't fear your no because they know it comes padded with softness, with hesitance, with doors left open. What if you became unreadable? What if your response broke the pattern? What if your silence wasn't confusion but closure? What if your kindness no longer bent into compliance? They wouldn't know what to do with you. And that's where your power begins. They'd trip over themselves or reach for familiar tactics, humor tears, withdrawal affection. But the moment you become unreadable, they lose their compass. And when they lose direction, they lose influence. You think people crave deep connection, but many don't want to understand you, they want to decode you, to learn what rattles you, what bends you. And the more they uncover, the more they maneuver you like familiar ground they've already charted. Machiavelli warned, never reveal the entirety of your mind. The mysterious are revered. The transparent are tested. You don't have to harden, but you do have to remain unpredictable. Stop being an instruction manual. They flip through whenever they want to manage your emotions. Become someone they must approach with awareness, not someone they can decode with ease. Let your stillness disorient them. Let your silence stretch. Let your reactions change. Become unreadable, not to harm, but to shield. Because once they can't anticipate your next step, they give up trying to control the board. And that's where your power begins, not in being seen, but in being elusive. Not by shouting, but by being beyond reach. You've treated the word loyal like a sacred metal, a symbol of integrity. You stayed well after your presence stopped being valued. You continued giving for giving and staying firm. Because they told you loyalty was admirable. Because leaving made you selfish. Because staying in someone else's dysfunction somehow made you good. But Machiavelli would have laughed at that notion. Not because loyalty is meaningless, but because loyalty without foresight is self-destruction. They weren't loyal to you. They were loyal to what you gave them, your steadiness, your availability, your silence, the way you never challenged their inconsistency. And still you called it love. You called it obligation. But what if it wasn't either? What if it was conditioning? What if it was fear? You stayed loyal to their potential, to their occasional goodness, to the crumbs between betrayals. And every time they let you down, you told yourself they were just lost or healing. But Machiavelli said loyalty that cannot be punished is not real. And that's what you forgot. You gave loyalty like a gift expecting nothing back. But in doing so, you taught them one thing, that you would stay no matter how far they strayed. You see, loyalty is virtue, but loyalty without limits is submission. They watched you remain when you should have walked. They saw you cover for their absence. They witnessed you defend their name while they damaged yours. And they took notes. They learned that your tolerance had no ceiling, that your forgiveness came without a clock. Your love came with no boundaries. That wasn't loyalty, it was access. And they used it skillfully. You never made them earn your presence, never asked them to meet you at your level, never let them feel the cost of your absence. You kept offering your value, hoping one day they'd recognize it. But Machiavelli understood people don't cherish what is constantly available. They value what might vanish. They value what challenges them to rise, not what waits passively to be seen. You thought leaving was betrayal, but staying through decay, that was the betrayal of yourself. So stop calling it loyalty when it's just fear of the unknown. Stop calling it love when it's really dependence on the familiar. Stop pretending that endurance alone is strength. Sometimes the boldest move you can make is pulling back what you once gave freely. You're not an anchor. You're not a proving ground for how much disrespect someone can throw your way before you collapse. You're not devoted to chaos. You are committed to your peace, your standards, your dignity. Yes, they want your loyalty. Make them earn it. And if they fail, let them feel the absence of what they took for granted. Because the longer you remain devoted to those who disrespect you, the more you tell the world you come without a cost. But you do have a cost. Your worth isn't in how long you stay, it's in how swiftly you leave. When staying means losing yourself, you believe kindness would protect you. That if you were gentle enough, patient enough, agreeable enough, others would reciprocate. You believe that if you made yourself easy to love, you'd be safe. That if you bent enough, they'd stop pushing. That if you gave freely, they'd stop taking. But they didn't. They took, and when there was nothing left, they still wanted more. You mistook your kindness for armor. But it wasn't protection, it was bait. Machiavelli didn't dismiss morality because he lacked principles, but because he understood how the world works. In a world full of predators, innocence isn't honored, it's targeted. It tells them you won't push back, that you'll rationalize instead of resist, that you'll keep suffering in silence, thinking pain means virtue. But suffering doesn't sanctify you, it just makes you easier to manipulate. You stayed somewhat when you needed to stand tall. You smiled when you should have stared. You apologize for having limits, for needing space, for expecting more, as if wanting dignity made you difficult. But you weren't ungrateful, you were shrinking. You were told that being loved meant being small. That's the lie, that being kind is enough, that politeness is power, that the quiet sufferer wins in the end. But look around. Who holds the power? Who commands the room when they enter? Who gets heard, respected, followed? Not the ones who shy away from conflict. Not the ones who fade for others' comfort. It's the one who sets the tone. The one who doesn't blink. The one who doesn't need validation to take action. You weren't born to be digestible. You weren't made to be soft enough for everyone to handle. You're here to exist unapologetically. And if your presence unsettles others, so be it. You've twisted yourself into too many shapes trying to be easy to love. Being good didn't shield you, it made you predictable. And predictable people are easy to control. They're safe to manipulate because they won't resist, won't interrupt. They'll simply endure. But staying isn't strength if it comes at the cost of your identity. So what if you stopped chasing goodness, not to become unkind, but to become truthful, to be sovereign? What if you dropped the act and stood firmly in your reality, even if it shook their comfort? What if your new version of compassion included space, silence, and not showing up for those who haven't earned your presence? Because you were taught that love requires sacrifice, that caring meant giving endlessly. But Machiavelli would have warned, only the naive give without boundary, and only the unwise believe affection offers protection. So stop hiding behind niceness. Stop shrinking behind good intentions. Stop assuming your virtue will prevent exploitation. This isn't bitterness, it's awakening. Because until you stop using your goodness against yourself, you'll keep confusing being walked on with being resilient. And you're not here to be trampled. You're here to rise, not gently, not silently, but entirely. They assigned you a role the day they met you, not through words, but through glances, assumptions, and silence. They made you the reliable one, the forgiver, the peace bringer, the one who doesn't ask much, who's always present, always accommodating. And you accepted the script. You wore the role. You learned the lines because you mistook it for intimacy. You thought it meant belonging, but it was just control wrapped in familiarity. At first, you didn't notice the slow erosion, how your needs faded, how your voice softened when it should have grown firm, how your convictions started to bend. You told yourself you were meeting in the middle, but you weren't. You were vanishing bit by bit, cutting off parts of yourself just to maintain the illusion. And they applauded you for being mature, for being so understanding, for your so-called grace. They called you strong, not because of your resilience, but because your silence served them. They called you wise, not because of your insight, but because your restraint protected their comfort. You weren't honored, you were handled. Machiavelli knew this long before it became psychological theory. He understood people aren't loyal to truth. They're loyal to the version of you that keeps their world unchallenged, the one who doesn't disrupt, doesn't question, doesn't threaten the illusion they've built. But what happens when you stop performing? When you tear up the script, they say you're cold, selfish, different. They accuse you of pulling away, of withholding affection because they can't reach you like they once could. Because you're no longer the reliable character in the story they wrote. You stepped off their stage, and now the silence, where your obedience once lived, leaves them unmoored. And that's when it hits you, it was never about love. It was about control, dressed up as concern about patterns mistaken for respect, about keeping you small enough to make them feel big. You didn't lose them. You lost the illusion. And now you have a decision: rewrite the part or keep disappearing inside theirs. What if you spoke before anyone asked? What if you quit sugarcoating the truth? What if you walked away without needing them to understand? The discomfort they feel when you evolve isn't proof you've done something wrong. It's proof you've stopped doing what made them feel secure. Burn the script. Let them sit in their confusion. Let them experience what it feels like when your performance ends. You were never meant to be a reflection of someone else's storyline. You are not here to be simple. You are not here to be smooth or silent. You are here to be raw, unframed, one of a kind. Because the moment you stop living to fit their idea of you, you begin to live from the strength you've kept hidden. You walk into the room and suddenly no one can read you. No one can follow the direction of your glance or interpret the silence you hold. You stop explaining. You stop softening your truth just to make it easier for them to hear. You stop tailoring your presence to match what they can handle. You've become unreadable. And in a world built on predictability, that's what makes you powerful. This is where the shift becomes complete, not through anger, not through payback, but through reclaiming your autonomy. They won't understand how you got here, how you became this composed, this precise, this silent. They reach for the same switches that once controlled you, and nothing happens. The pattern is gone. The script has been destroyed. Guilt no longer sways you. Compliments no longer move you. Rejection doesn't shake you. They used to count on a predictable version of you. Now they guess and get it wrong. Machiavelli said it clearly, it is better to be feared than loved when you can't be both. But he wasn't promoting cruelty. He was talking about presence, about influence, about that unspoken intensity that makes people tread carefully, not out of fear, but because they can sense what you're no longer offering freely. You don't chase, you don't plead, you don't perform. And that's what unnerves them. You've grown impervious to their games, the stalling, the mixed signals, the subtle digs. You see every move. You simply choose not to respond. You've stepped out of their performance and become the force that shifts the entire stage. You've tapped into a power that doesn't need to shout. It just changes the temperature of the room. Your absence delivered a message your presence never could. Your silence became the final boundary. Now when they mention your name, it's not with ease, but with hesitation. Because people don't fear what you say. They fear what they can't predict, what they can't read, what they no longer control. You're no longer their mirror. You're a barrier, a quiet they can't penetrate. And in that silence, you've said more than words ever could. This is your final evolution, not louder but stiller. Not more emotional but more exact. You've let go of needing to be seen, needing to be understood, needing approval. And in that letting go, you've stepped into your fullest power. They may call it pride, they may call it ego, but what they're really responding to is a version of you they no longer recognize, the one who no longer wavers, who no longer explains, who no longer makes herself small. You are sovereign now. You move with intention, not impulse. You speak with purpose, not habit. You walk not to lead others, but because you don't need to wait any longer. Let them sit with it. Let them feel what it's like to miss what they once had easy access to. Let that silence echo louder than any goodbye. Because this is what happens when you reclaim your selfhood. You become the puzzle they can't solve, the door they can't open, the quiet storm that shifts everything without making a sound.